Finnegan, the silent treader, colloquially known as Old Sly Feet, was an ancient but relatively minor deity in the sprawling, syncretic pantheon of Jixavan religion. Only a tiny percentage of shrines across the United Jixavan Republic were dedicated to him, only a handful on the planet Zataka 4, and none at all in the city of Skana's Rest. Which was too bad, because for a single day each year, Finnegan's holy day, an otherwise indifferently religious young human who lived in that city became his most fervent and fanatical devotee. Her name was Arizona Penelope Xerathexes, and the holy day of Finnegan, the god of mischief-making, was her most favorite day of the year. "It's funny," sighed Vika Xerathexes as she tried to corner the food cinther that was floating around the kitchen, bobbing and weaving to evade her grasp, "but even though I know what to expect from Ari every year on pranking day, I still never expect what I get." She reached out suddenly with her lower right arm, blocking the cinther's avenue of escape that way. Foiled, the appliance floated up to the ceiling above the Jixavan girl's reach, waiting. "Were your mind the sort that could expect all this, I would fear for your sanity, darling," replied the Felra who was blocking the doorway to keep the cinther from escaping the kitchen. This was Shirala Rishinalin, Vika's roommate. "I mean, the cottage cheese cannons were a borderline acceptable level of pranking, but the rest of it? There is only one mind both deranged and shameless enough to devise the trials we have suffered this morning." "You're gonna make me blush, praising me like that," a third voice called from the den, where a certain person was half-heartedly cleaning cottage cheese off the walls. "Less talking, more cleaning," Vika and Shirala shouted back, in near chorus with each other. The two young women shared only a few things in common, exasperation with the apartment's third occupant being the main one this morning. Both were green and six-limbed, Vika being a four-armed, short-tailed reptiloid of noteworthy adorableness, while Shirala was an emphatically mammalian centauroid often described as hot but vaguely unsettling. Both were young women of intellect and accomplishment, if in very different ways. Both were also liberally splattered with cottage cheese. "How come I have to do all the cleaning?" the third voice called back, aggrieved. "Really?" Vika demanded as she made a jump for the food cinther, just missing it as it bobbled and sideslipped just beyond her fingertips. "You ambushed us twice with an entire battery of miniature cottage cheese cannons in the den, and now you're asking why you have to clean up the aftermath." "I wouldn't be me if I didn't ask that," the voice retorted. "Don't expect me to be something I'm not, sis." Shirala nodded at this. She has a point, though I am loath to admit it. Arizona would not be the girl we know and you love if she did not try to weasel out of responsibility for her actions. As the Felra spoke, she was scrubbing industriously at her exposed skin with a soapy rag, pausing every so often to swipe a powerful variable output magnet over herself. The reason for doing so was obvious, and had little to do with the cottage cheese. Rather, it seemed that someone, Arizona, of course, had coated the inside of Shirala's morning dressing gown with programmable microbiota ink which, when activated by the heat of a Felra body, attached itself to her skin, spelling out the words, "Coochie Monster," in big black letters, over and over, from her neck to her tail tip. The ink could be removed only once the microbots that comprised it had been deactivated by magnetic disruption. The magnet required to do this had to be obtained from a tool supply store some distance away. As Shirala's wardrobe was composed mostly of garments that covered comparatively little of her skin, that impromptu shopping trip had resulted in her being called Miss Coochie Monster by 3 clerks, the store manager, the taxi's AI driver, and 4 random people on the street, all of whom had snickered as they said it. Even the taxi AI. But no one had asked what happened to her. It was pranking day, after all. The food cinther tried to make a run for it, but the very basic lift and drive motor that Arizona had fitted to it had to shift power from one function to the other, meaning that more drive force meant less lifting force. So, while it moved somewhat quickly for a countertop-sized kitchen appliance, it lost altitude in doing so. Vika's hands couldn't get a grip on it, but she managed to bat it back into its corner. Arizona had also fitted a very basic evasion protocol controller from a children's toy to the food cinther. Its programming allowed it to recognize and avoid capture attempts, and that should have been about it. It should not have been capable of sulking or plotting retribution, but Vika had the creepiest feeling that the food synth was doing exactly that. Most likely, this was her own subconscious projecting. But then again, considering who had modified the food synth in the first place. I wake up to find my bed covered in fake dagger bugs. I try to fix breakfast, but the food synth is floating around the kitchen. I hear a yell from my roommate, who's been covered in graffiti, and when I run into the den to check on her, we get fired on by cottage cheese artillery. Vika shook her head. It's not even mid-morning yet, for the God's sakes. You know, most people just celebrate pranking day with a fake hollow call or a hot stinger bean disguised as a piece of candy. That's because most people suck. Arizona called from the den. Shirala's tail lashed and her hind feet shuffled in place. No, I suspect that's because most people have other interests in their lives aside from annoying those around them for their own juvenile amusement. Like I said, they suck. Shirala sighed and went on, still, one has to admire the effort and creativity Arizona puts into these things. I can only imagine the progress she might make if she worked this hard at an actual job. What can I say? Arizona sounded insufferably smug. I don't do much, but what I do the hell out of. Shirala just made a little growling noise that Vika had never heard from her before. It put Vika in mind of a predator that was poised to spring but decided at the last second that the prey wasn't worth the effort, yet still wanted the prey to realize how close it had come to being messily dismembered. That growl trailed off into a rueful chuckle as Shirala started scrubbing her other foreleg. The Felra had managed to get both arms and one leg almost coochie monster free. I'm sorry my sister is like this. Vika was no stranger to playing peacemaker in the wake of Arizona's antics. I appreciate that you're keeping your cool about all this. Shirala's tail rippled, a Felra equivalent to a shrug. It's pranking day and I live with Arizona Xerifexes. If I knowingly walk into the primate enclosure at the zoo, I've no room to protest when the tree screechers hurl their droppings at me. Vika made another grab for the synth. It was losing altitude a little, so maybe the power was getting low. It was still out of her reach, though. Still, she said, I'm sorry she's so crazy sometimes. Shirala burst out laughing at that. Crazy? Arizona? Oh, no. Your sister is merely a bit quirky. An eccentric, perhaps. I've dealt with full-bore verminship berserk lunacy before. I once knew a Venjari crusader. Arizona at her most caffeinated and hyperactive is a mere passing breeze compared to the tornado of insanity that is a Venjari. A patter of running feet announced Arizona's arrival, in all her glory, a squeegee in one hand and a cheese-smeared rag in the other. Petite and snub-nosed, she had been accurately described as looking like a member of the pep squad at a school for stoners. You met a Venjari, she squealed. The big, huge, black and silver guys with the arms and the cool hair. The ones that do suborbital jumps without parachutes for fun. Those guys? Ooh, I've always wanted to meet one. And by meet, I mean fuck. Yes, I did meet one, Shirala answered, very admirably not choking Arizona senseless despite the human girl now being within her reach. It was, in fact, on my voyage here to Zataka. He was a passenger, I suppose, on the liner I was traveling on. She shook her head and chuckled darkly. I saw him as we were embarking, and found out he was a crusader. That was the point where I, a wiser person, would have turned around, got off the ship, and waited to book passage on the next one. What's so bad about that? Vika asked. She was still eyeing the synth, which was definitely having a harder time maintaining altitude. You must understand that, by galactic standards, most Venjari are quite insane, manic-depressive lunatics with poor impulse control and very little sense of self-preservation. Well, crusaders are violent, suicidal lunatics by Venjari standards. They organize into little groups called bands that are sort of a cross between a knightly order, a death cult, and a traveling orgy. These bands then go around looking for other people's wars to get involved in, the more hopeless and one-sided, the better. They seek out doomed causes and, basically undoom them. Which they can usually do, since your typical Venjari crusader is a 9-foot-tall, 4-armed, nearly unkillable bundle of rage and hedonism backed by centuries if not millennia of combat experience. Vika shuddered. They sound awful. Shirala rippled her tail again. Meh, like any, they have their good points and bad. They are enamored of war, not murder, so they are not usually dangerous to non-combatants. And while they have occasionally sided with some rather sketchy causes, we have them to thank for the core worlds not conquering all of us. Why do you think the galactic core races work by buying up media to spread propaganda, or subsidizing groups like the Ribathi or the Terran Commonwealth to work against the armed nations instead of just sending out fleets and armies to subdue us? With their wealth and technology, it would be a totally one-sided war. So terribly one-sided and unwinnable for us, that not a single crusader in the galaxy would be able to resist joining in on our behalf. The core worlds know that, and are terrified of it. Their civilizations may be ancient, wicked, and rich beyond imagining, but the Venjari are even older, more advanced, and absolutely fucking insane. A war against the core would be for them what pranking day is for Arizona. Enough history lesson, Arizona snapped. You met one. Did you fuck him? With a sigh, Shirala continued. So, I boarded the ship despite knowing that a crusader was aboard. My thought was that we were passing through peaceful and civilized space. There were no conflict zones on our flight path and the Tark Imperial border was quite a ways off. There should be no trouble. And, when I met Thurandos personally, he seemed a surprisingly stable and agreeable sort, for a Venjari. That served to assuage my fears. Unfortunately. Why unfortunately? Vika asked. Because, 3 days into the voyage, he hijacked the ship, altered our course to an unclaimed system well above the galactic ecliptic, and declared that all the passengers and crew were now his personal army. Vika's face darkened, a Jixavan frown. Didn't anyone try to resist? Oh, there were protests made, but nothing physical. There were 1,500 of us passengers and 100 crew. Even if we'd been properly armed, killing us all would have been an afternoon's work for a crusader, especially a senior member of the bloody tears of rage like Thurandos. No, people argued, pleaded, and even offered bribes, but in the end we all went along. He spent the next 3 weeks organizing us into units and equipping us with whatever weapons we could fabricate from the ship stores and tool lockers. Mostly blades, polearms, and some projectile throwers. The passengers who were too old or too young to serve as infantry were put to work doing this. For the rest, those of us with military experience became officers and the civilians. You have military experience? Arizona interrupted, but Shirala ignored her. The civilians became line troopers. And I must admit that the training he put us through was rather enjoyable. I have never in my life heard so many obscene marching cadences, and the hand-to-hand combat drills turned into a rather fun tournament in which yours truly took the third-place medal. At any rate, after several weeks of this, we suddenly find ourselves landing on an uncontacted world whose Bronze Age society was under attack by a full Ribathi slaving force. We took their mothership in a boarding action, then landed and wiped out the Ribathi ground forces in a 10-day campaign, sacked and looted their main base, and received the gratitude of the natives at a huge drunken feast/orgy. Then we loaded back up, patched up our few minor casualties, disbanded the army, and resumed our trip, roughly a month behind schedule. Vika looked doubtful. So, 1,500 miscellaneous passengers armed with random junk easily defeated 20 times their number of fully armed Ribathi soldiers, without losses? What can I say? Venjari are crazy, but they are astoundingly good at leadership. Arizona had a more pressing question, which had nothing to do with military ability. Yeah, she said. Very impressive. But did you fuck him? Shirala stared her right in the eyes. Calmly, coolly, with virtually no inflection to her voice, she said, "Yes. For 6 days straight. When we landed here, I had to be wheeled off the ship, as my rear legs no longer worked. My tail was stuck in the raised position for a week, I was partially dehydrated, and I had sprained my tongue." Arizona just stared right back at her, silent. Considering scratching her but with the squeegee. "That aside," said Vika, "how did that Crusader guy know about the Ribothi attacking that planet?" "According to him, he did not," Shirala replied with a certain amount of relish. "He simply got bored on a long trip and thought it would be funny to try and conquer something. The Ribothi being there was merely a happy accident." "I'm not certain I'd believe that." Vika sounded just a bit distracted, having turned her attention back to the food cinther. It was slowly drifting within her reach. Shirala waved a hand airily. "It is what he said." "Yeah, well, I'm not certain I believe any of it." Arizona had apparently completed her considerations. The butt-scratching still had a ways to go. "I think you're making up a tall tale to make me look gullible. It is pranking day, after all. That, and you want to seem all cool, like I didn't completely own you with my awesome pranking skills." Shirala gave her the same kind of look a gourmet chef gives to a frozen corn dog. "You are free to believe whatever you like, Arizona. I certainly do not care enough about your opinion to try and convince you of anything." There was a sudden yell from the other side of the kitchen as Vika managed to jump up and get 2 hands on the food cinther. The cheap lift-and-drive system Arizona had fitted to it strained hard against the sudden weight, draining its power pack in a matter of seconds. With a sad, grudging little whine, it sank to the countertop and allowed itself to be reconnected to the power/matter feed. Vika's face yellowed happily. "Finally. I'm starving. All I've had to eat this morning was a mouthful of cottage cheese from your stupid cannons." She quickly punched in a breakfast order, waiting as the cinther hummed purposefully, creating her meal. "What do you guys want to?" Vika never got to finish that question as the cinther let out a cheery ding, slid open its creation chamber door, and began spraying out cottage cheese like some dairy-based fire hose. And over the screams and splatters that filled the kitchen, the high voice of a human rang out in triumph. "Ha! Pranking day doesn't end till sundown, bitches."